So, on today's episode, I fully was prepared to break down day one of National Signing Day in the early signing period. I did not expect to break down a wild Tuesday night that we had as LSU fans. What happened? What does that mean for LSU football? All that and so much more on today's edition of Locked On LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Plus, we are on YouTube as well. So check us out there. Make sure to subscribe to the YouTube page and you won't miss a second of your Locked On LSU content. But we're part of the Locked On Network, of course, your team every day. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I'm your host, as I am every day. I graduated from LSU. I've been covering the team since 2016. And I now host a sports talk radio show in Nashville, Tennessee. Before we get into the wild and crazy night that Tuesday was, I want to let y'all know that today's edition of Locked On LSU is brought to you by Sling TV. Sling has something for everyone, especially when it comes to college football coverage. So it's got a massive lineup of games across the ACC, the Big Ten, the Pac-12, and SEC. I can always catch the games, and it's bowl season, so you can catch them there on Sling. I do that, and now you can too. So check out Sling TV now to see the massive lineup of games that they have all season long. Sling, the TV you love for a price you'll love. Try it today. So I did a little bit of a early signing period, National Signing Day preview on a podcast earlier this week. And I said, hey, what I'm looking for, really what I'm prioritizing. And I highlighted how LSU was going to have to look in the transfer portal for a running back depth and tight end depth. They're in need of that mightily. Offensive line depth is never a bad thing. But I highlighted some of the players that I thought LSU was going to target, or players that I would love, to wear a purple and gold hat on National Signing Day. And all four of those, and really without any intention of my own, I was just kind of looking at players that were high on LSU, looking at players of positions of need for LSU, looking at players that were, elite in their position groups. And it just so happened to be that all four of those players that I highlighted on, I believe it was Tuesday's episode, were all defensive players. Because that's really, even subconsciously, kind of how I viewed the needs for this 2023 LSU football team. While it needs tight end depth, 100%. I have spoke about this ad nauseum. Cole Taylor leaving the program. Mason Taylor has showed to be an incredibly promising young tight end. I'm excited to see what leaps and bounds and improvements he makes in his second year after being such a massive contributor and a great player in year one. But I thought, okay, Cole Taylor leaving the program, it's going to be the Mason Taylor show, but this team needs tight end depth, especially because, any team needs tight end depth, but especially because of how Brian Kelly and Mike Denbrock love to use the tight end, about how much they love to, use the tight end creatively. We saw it with Mason Taylor this year, sometimes almost to a fault, where I was watching these games and I was thinking, what are you doing? Quit throwing the ball to the freshman tight end. Please throw the ball downfield to your All-American wide receiver. But I digress, because those two are as good as any of using the tight end creatively. So of course that's a position of need. But the four players that I highlighted, like I mentioned, were all defensive players. Desmond Ricks, cornerback; Nicholas Harbor, edge rusher, who I don't think is going to end up committing to LSU. He's one player that I don't, after the episode on Tuesday, I found that he most likely will sign in the spring, so don't expect to see his name over the next few days. Jordan Hall, a defensive lineman; and Isaac Smith, a safety. Cornerback depth, defensive back depth, safety depth, and defensive line depth. And that's exactly what LSU got on Tuesday night. As I was up late at night preparing for National Signing Day, writing down all of my notes, getting everything prepared, getting, the best possible show that I can make for y'all, I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like bombarded with LSU football news. Like I felt for a second like I was drinking recruiting news from a fire hose. I was like, is something glitching? Is something going wrong? Because in a matter of 3 minutes, LSU had 3 transfer portal commits. Who are those players? What can they bring to LSU in 2023? How does that impact National Signing Day? I want to get into all of that coming up next. We will meet the 3 newest LSU Tigers, at least through the transfer portal, coming up next. But before we do that, I want to tell you about Bet Online. Because betonline.net is your number one source for sports betting information, stats, news, and analysis. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. There's pro football, college bowl season, one of my favorites to bet on. I love betting on college bowl season because it truly is the wild, wild west. We've got basketball, both at the college level and the NBA level. We've got it all at betonline.net. So if you love sports podcasts, you can even find those at BetOnline as well. Always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting information. So head to the website today, use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. So make sure to check out our Locked On Sports today. The biggest stories around the sports world in 20 minutes or less, plus instant reactions, game recaps, and Locked On's take of the day. Locked On Sports today, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. So, just a freaking crazy night on Tuesday night. Some late night specialists up making their commitments through the transfer portal. Now, I want to do a full breakdown of the 2023 class and National Signing Day. We'll get into all of that. All of that content will come. But I want to focus on Tuesday night and what LSU gained through the transfer portal and what that means. First and foremost, 3 of the players that committed to LSU through the transfer portal, and also just for what it's worth, on Tuesday night, LSU also got a commitment from 2025 LSU legacy Brett Bordelon, little brother of Bo Bordelon. So that, is in the 2025 class. That's not going to be included in today's episode, but that's just for your knowledge. Brett Bordelon, the 2025 class. So put that in your calendars. First commitment that we saw through the transfer portal, Arizona defensive end Paris Shand. He's a redshirt sophomore, 6'5", 295. Good size there. He spent 3 seasons at Arizona, but of course redshirted that first year. He's played in 23 total games, so all but 1 game in the last 2 years. In those 23 games, he's recorded 41 tackles. 5.5 of those are for loss, 5 sacks, and 2 forced fumbles. Now, in the 2022 season, he recorded 23 tackles, 2.5 sacks, and 1 forced fumble. So what is valuable about bringing in Paris Shand beyond just this team needs defensive line depth? Because with the size and production and experience at that position, the hole that this Arizona defensive end Paris Shand could fill is the hole that was created by Ali Gaye's exit. Like I just mentioned, 2022 Paris Shand, 23 tackles. In 2022, Ali Gaye had 35 tackles. In 2022, Paris Shand had 2.5 sacks. Ali Gaye had 2. In 2022, Paris Shand had 1 forced fumble. Ali Gaye had 2. So you kind of see that there. While, there's a little bit of a discrepancy there with the total number of tackles. Paris Shand had a very similar production to Ali Gaye. Paris Shand can be able to compete for that true defensive end spot. But it's not going to be a given. You've got defensive end depth with Savion Jones, he was Ali Gaye's backup this past year. He has experience on the team, not immense experience, but Savion Jones has been able to record some stats this year. He's also one that I'm looking at to potentially fill in that Jack linebacker role, that kind of pure pass rush specialist role that BJ Ojulari, that hole that BJ Ojulari has created since he's exited to the NFL draft. So I'm looking at Savion Jones to be competing for that position as well. Also, you've got true freshman Quincy Wiggins, who I don't necessarily view as a front runner by any means for this position. And that's no disrespect to Quincy Wiggins. It's just the fact that he was a true freshman this past year. He redshirted this past year. It could probably aid him to sit 1 more year, especially when you have 2 guys in Savion Jones and now Paris Shand that can, compete and have experience. Savion Jones has less experience than Paris Shand, but Savion Jones has LSU experience. So I'm looking at those 2 to be competing with Paris Shand for this defensive end role, and you can probably see them start to rotate in and out in that defensive end role. So again, Arizona defensive end Paris Shand committed to LSU through the transfer portal last night. The second one, Florida nose tackle, Jalen Lee, redshirt sophomore. The key thing here is Jalen Lee is a Baton Rouge kid. He went to Live Oak High School in Denham Springs. He's an in-state kid who went to Florida. He was committed to LSU earlier in his high school career, eventually decommitted, decided to go to Florida, has spent the last 3 seasons at Florida. So what's key about this? Bringing in-state kids back, keeping in-state talent in Louisiana. It's one of Brian Kelly's top priorities. He mentioned that this past week. He's been mentioning that all throughout the season, but this was Brian Kelly on the priority of keeping talent in-state or bringing in-state talent back to Louisiana.
We're going to identify the best prospects, throughout the country, and you'll see that in this signing class. We'll have players from the Northeast, from the Midwest, from the West Coast, but our base will be Louisiana and the South. But I don't think you can, when you're LSU and you have a brand that is so recognizable throughout the entire country, you can't have blinders on either, where you go, oh, I'm just in Louisiana and I'm not going outside it. So our scope and vision is national, but it's not like we're pulling, 4 guys out of every state. We're going to have a heavy influence in the state of Louisiana like we should, but we're going to know where the best players are in the country as well.
And I think that's a fair approach. But Brian, the meat and potatoes of the message is we want the best players in this state to come to LSU. We want to build this program through players that are from Louisiana and have ties to the state of Louisiana and to LSU. We're going to recruit the best players in the country because this team is trying to compete for a championship. But the backbone and the foundation of this team is players that are from Louisiana. And Jalen Lee, a kid who decided to spend his first 3 years of his eligibility at Florida, deciding to come back to LSU, I think is huge. So he's 6'2", 299-pound nose tackle. So he spent, like I mentioned, 3 years at Florida. Redshirt sophomore, though, so he has 3 years remaining of eligibility. In 2022, he had 8 tackles, 0 sacks. He played but didn't start in 12 games. I believe he started in 5 games this past year, but throughout his 3 seasons at Florida, he played in 25 games, had 19 tackles, 3 of those for loss, and 1 sack. So just like I mentioned with Paris Shand, the hole that he could fill is the hole that was left when Ali Gaye left the program, when Ali Gaye, is going on to bigger and better things. For Jalen Lee, nose tackle, the hole that he could fill is the hole that's left by Jaqueline Roy. Now that Jaqueline Roy has decided to declare for the NFL draft. And overall, this team needed defensive line depth. I mean, you got Mekhi Wingo and you got Mason Smith on the interior defensive line. Mekhi Wingo has proven to be, a leader on this team, a playmaker for this team. We know Mason Smith's ability, but the question has to remain, when is Mason Smith going to be 100%? They usually say that ACL recoveries take about a calendar year. That's the one good thing about getting injured during your ACL the first week of the year. You can probably be projected to be back in the first game of the year in the next season, but that's no guarantee that Mason Smith is going to be 100% at full strength. That's no guarantee that Mason Smith is going to feel 100% mentally confident. While the recovery is 10 to 12 months, and he will be able to suit up. I'm guessing just based off of timelines in the past. Players in the past who turn their ACLs, they come back within 10 to 12 months. But it doesn't mean that you come back as the same player that you were before you tore your ACL. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. So adding a little bit of depth to the interior defensive line, and I'm not assuming that Mason Smith is going to take leaps and bounds steps back. I just think that that's something that we have to keep in mind when you're thinking about depth and needs on this team. Even though Mason Smith is going to be able to contribute a whole heck of a lot more this upcoming year, fingers crossed, than he did this past year, you still need depth there. You still need guys that are going to be able to rotate in and out just in case he is not 100% good to go. So the position that was left, Jaqueline Roy, again, declared for the NFL draft. I don't think that's any surprise to anybody. Jaqueline Roy played in that nose tackle position. Jalen Lee is a position that is a player that can fill in that position and compete for a starting spot at that nose tackle position. And the third and final commitment that we saw from the transfer portal in the 2023 class is an Oregon edge rusher, Bradyn Swinson. Now, that's a name that I mentioned a few weeks ago when I was looking at transfer portal targets. He's from Georgia, 6'4", 235 pounds. He has 2 years remaining of eligibility. He played his last 3 years at Oregon, like I mentioned. He played in 30 games. He had 1 start in those 30 games. In total, within his career, those 30 games in 3 years at Oregon, 35 tackles, 5.5 of those for loss, and 3 sacks. In 2022, he had 8 tackles. So not, the 8 tackles was his final stat line. No sacks, no tackles for loss. So my question there is, what happened in 2022 where it seemed like Bradyn Swinson took a little bit of a step back? Was it the scheme? That his size and his ability just didn't complement this defensive scheme? Remember that Oregon had almost a full coaching turnover this past year. So things changed, and sometimes players just don't fit in certain schemes. Did Bradyn Swinson just get buried in the depth chart? That Oregon is known for bringing in some of the top edge rushers in the country. So was Bradyn Swinson just pushed down the depth chart and he didn't get the opportunity to be out there and contribute as much as he had maybe his freshman and sophomore year? That's kind of one thing that I'm looking at, but Bradyn Swinson is going to be able to come in and compete for the opportunity to fill the hole that was left with BJ Ojulari. And those are not easy shoes to fill. Jaqueline Roy, Ali Gaye, BJ Ojulari, none of those are easy shoes to fill. But now you at least have depth that can compete for those positions. I mean, Bradyn Swinson can kind of play that pass rush specialist role. Xavier Carter is another one on the roster that could potentially compete for that position. But Xavier Carter has very little experience. Xavier Carter is still young and still could have some developing to do. So edge rusher absolutely was a position of need and depth. So while you can, nitpick the experience or the size or the stats from some of these 3 players throughout their careers or in the 2022 season, I think the most important thing to take away here is that LSU got so much depth. And it's not even just players. It's not even just bodies. It's players that have real college experience. And 2 of these 3 players that have committed have 3 years of eligibility remaining. And the only one that doesn't is Bradyn Swinson, and he has 2 years of eligibility remaining. That's something that Brian Kelly mentioned in his press conference on Saturday was, we don't want to keep bringing guys in here that have 1 year and you just completely, you turn over your roster, half your roster every single year because you're bringing in guys with a lot of experience, but only 1 year of eligibility remaining or very little eligibility remaining. Or maybe they want to declare for the NFL draft, so on and so forth. So that's going to be big for this LSU team, is to gain depth, to gain experience, and also guys that can come into the program and contribute to the program for more than just 1 season. But coming up next, what is this defensive line shaping up to be? And what does 2023 bring in for this LSU class in terms of the defensive line? Now that they have some shiny new toys on the defensive line, we'll get into that coming up next. So, some defensive line depth was absolutely paramount for this LSU team. And now that they gained 3 more through the transfer portal, the job's not done yet. Because looking at the 2023 defensive line in terms of returners, you've got Mason Smith. I think that we all are excited to get Mason Smith back. I know I am. I'm sure you are too. But I'll reiterate the point that I made earlier of, I don't know which Mason Smith we're going to get in the first couple of weeks of the season. Is he going to be 100%? Is he going to experience setbacks? Is he so on and so forth? I don't, knock on all the wood. But I think it's a realistic thing that we need to look into. Is Mason Smith coming back? That's huge, but might not be 100% Mason Smith. And you got Jaqueline Roy, who has 1 start in 25 games. Mekhi Wingo, who I'm pumped to see develop in his 2nd year at LSU and his 3rd year in college football. And you've got Savion Jones. That's a name that I've talked about a lot over the past few weeks because I think that Savion Jones can fill in a few different roles on the defensive line. He can fill in that defensive end role. He was Ali Gaye's backup this past year. But I think you also look at his size, And he can also be an edge rusher for you. He can compete for BJ Ojulari's role. So I'm looking at Savion Jones, a kid who's had a couple years at LSU, a couple years of development under his belt. I think that we could be poised for a Savion Jones breakout year coming up this year. So even if that's not a name that you recognize or not a name that you remember seeing on Saturday night in Death Valley, that's a name that you should probably remember, because I think that Savion Jones is, one of those diamonds that's been developing in the rough over the past couple of years, and now is his time to shine. Quincy Wiggins is another one. He was a redshirt freshman this past year. We can probably see him contribute in the bowl game. So I don't have, a ton to say about Quincy Wiggins because we haven't seen a lot of him. He did redshirt this past year, like I mentioned, but that was a name that Brian Kelly mentioned who got some looks in the scrimmage this past Saturday. He was a guy who is going to be utilized in the bowl game because he won't have to exercise. He won't have to, use up his redshirt eligibility in his freshman year playing the bowl game. That's not a thing anymore, which is going to be incredibly helpful for really every team. But especially in terms of depth, and also every team in terms of, let's see what we've got. Let's see what you can do. Show me what you can do. I'll put you out in a game so that way you have at least a little bit of in-game experience and we can spend the offseason developing and you'll be ready to go in week 1. So, a lot of those names that I named, Mason Smith, you probably know. Mekhi Wingo, those are more like LSU household names. But overall, those are a lot of names that haven't gotten a ton of experience. So you bring in 3 guys that do have college experience at a very high level, Power 5 experience at, Florida, you got SEC experience, Oregon. You're playing at the top of college football. Arizona playing some of the top teams in the country in the Pac-12 this past year. These are some great bolstering and building pieces for this LSU team. And coming in 2023, at least where it stands right now, things can change over the next few weeks. Things can change now that we're in the early signing period. You got Deshaun Womack, who's a 4-star edge rusher. He's 6'4", 240 pounds. He could probably stand to put on a little bit of weight. But that's one player that's going to be able to compete from day one. You've also got Jackson Howard, who's an edge rusher out of Minnesota, another 4-star, the top recruit out of the state of Minnesota. He's coming in and compete for the edge rusher position. You've got a plethora of players that are coming in that can contribute on the defensive line. Jalen Lee is one that is one that came in, the Florida transfer. So, you've got building blocks and you've got pieces, and this is a step in the right direction. While we don't know necessarily who will be at which position, we don't come into this year with as much comfort as we did this past year, knowing the commodities of BJ Ojulari, knowing the commodities of Ali Gaye, knowing the commodities of Mason Smith, of course, before he got injured. But now, we don't have those pieces, those comfort pieces, the pieces that we know what to expect. I think we have a good idea of Mekhi Wingo. We can hope for the best for Mason Smith. So we're going into this 2023 season a little bit more blind on the defensive line and edge rusher positions, really, on the defense as a whole. But this program, in terms of recruiting and in transfer portal, it's headed in the right direction. They're gaining pieces that need depth. And it's not just bodies. It's bodies with talent, and it's bodies with experience. And I think when you're looking to recruit, especially through the transfer portal, that's what you need to look for. Experience, talent, and how can you come in here and help our team win right away? Excuse me. So we will continue to follow the early signing period. I will get y'all updated with all of the most recent signings from Wednesday and Thursday and the rest of the week of the early signing period, plus what comes next for this team. We'll get into all of that on the later episodes of Locked On LSU this week. So thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen today, but make your second listen today Locked On Sports Today. Peter Bukowski brings you the biggest stories from around the sports world in 20 minutes. Get the analysis and opinions before anyone else with our local and national experts and insiders. Locked On Sports Today podcast. It's available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.